we will finish by looking into how we can solve some of the problems that will occur over the coming years without laying any cables at all. So just by influencing customers. So let's delve into it. So the energy transition, there we are increasingly fast moving towards a more sustainable future, which is great, of course. So people are buying more electric cars. There are more solar and wind parks being connected, and a lot of more houses are getting turned from how they look on the right of this image to something on the left. So more isolated, solar panels on the roof, charging station for your car in your front yard, electric heating. And it isn't slowing down. So, but the big question is, we have a very old infrastructure in many places. So, can this actually keep up with these fast changes that are happening all around us? And that's where grid operators come in. So, they don't just construct and maintain cables. Grid operators, their main role is actually to ensure that electricity goes from point A to point B. So they are also responsible for the stability of the grid. So they ensure that supply and demand are balanced. They connect large and small customers properly to the grid. And they will also monitor the grid and try to prevent power outages, which they are very, very successful in, at least here in the Netherlands. Because that doesn't happen quite often. And Alliander is one of them in the Netherlands. It's one of the largest. It has over 3 million connected households and companies. So that's quite a bit. So the energy transition. What does that mean for small customers, and why we will look at small customers? Larger customers, they are way more predictable, actually. So when you have a large company or like a factory or something like that, someone that uses a lot of power or generates a lot of power, when they are connected to the grid, they actually have to make arrangements with a grid operator about how much can they supply or consume. So they actually are limited by their contract, which mostly ensures that not too many large customers are connected at once on a grid that can handle it. But this is changing a little bit because currently how does this work for small customers? Because currently, when you have an electric car and you want a charging station, you can just call Coolblue or go to their website and they will install it for you. And they won't talk to Alliander that they are doing that, because and they won't even if someone puts solar panels on their roof, like Alliander doesn't know about that. So will this cause any problems? Well, if some people in your street getting electric cars, electric charging stations, well, that won't matter too much. But if your entire street just switches over to solar panels or electric cars, that can cause issues down the line. And we are seeing that already. So, complaints about voltage, they have actually multiplied by 4 in 2020 when compared to 2019. So there are a lot more people calling already about problems they have with the stability of their power supply. And the problem here is that for much of the low voltage grid, we are still in the dark. So on the medium voltage grid, which is basically the grid that connects the powerhouses, the transformer buildings that you see in the streets to each other, and where the larger customers are connected to, there is a lot of measurements taking place there. And Alliander has a lot of control over what connects to the medium voltage grid. But on the low voltage grids, that's not that much the case. So there are less measurements, and there are many smaller and sometimes very old cables, because these are actually the cables that connect the individual houses to the energy grid. And there's also some data quality issues. Like there's a pretty big register. There's a pretty big data warehouse where all the assets are registered, but this isn't always complete. And I come across that a lot during my work, like things that aren't properly registered. So this is quite difficult to predict what is happening there compared to the medium voltage grids. So the question then is, can we do better? Is it maybe, or have there been developments in the last few years that would allow us to make better predictions about the low voltage grid? Well, and luckily there have, because a lot of houses now have smart meters, and they are becoming increasingly common. And Alliander, they are gathering a large amounts of data from those, and all grid operators do, by the way. So we get lots of data about the power uses of individual households, which is mostly anonymized because privacy issues, of course. But there's still a lot available. And we can combine it with other data sets that we have to actually try to look into trends and maybe make predictions about the low voltage grid. So yeah, for example, we have this power consumption data of customers, but we can also estimate what the power consumption of production is of new technology. So for instance, heat pumps or electric vehicles or solar panels, we can make pretty accurate estimates about when they will produce or consume how much energy and what kind of strain they will put on the grid. And because a lot of data has been gathered over the past years already, there's also we can also look into the adoption of new technologies. So what kind of neighborhoods or customers are actually getting electric cars and at what rate, and we can make predictions about that as well. So when we add that all together, all this data, then we can try to estimate what kind of peak consumption or production of power we expect in the future in low voltage grids. So when we take a certain grid, we can currently use our measurements from smart meters to estimate some sort of base load peak performance, so peak consumption. So we can estimate what is the maximum strain a certain grid, a certain neighborhood now puts on the grid in the current year. That's what you see on the left, like the two orange bars, and we can actually take that as a percentage of what the remaining capacity, what the capacity of the cables and the transformers actually allow. So we can make an estimate about how much space is left for more peak consumption or production. And it's important to note that for cables and transformers, this can differ, as you can see here as well. Like for this specific example, there's a lot more room left on the LDN side. And LDN is, by the way, these are Dutch terms. It's called levering door net, and ODN is called, it stands for opwek door net, which basically means like levering. So the LDN is production, and ODN is LDN is the consumption of energy, and ODN is the production of energy. So solar panels. But the amount of space left can differ for the transformer and for the cables. So when we have those base loads and we have those estimates of peak performance of certain technologies, so EV, which stands for electric vehicles, PV for photovoltaic, I think, solar panels at least, and electric heating. When we have those estimates of those peak performances of those technologies and the adoption rates, we can estimate for a given year how the peak strain on the grid what the peak strain on the grid will look like. So you would guess, well, that's just adding some things together. Well, it's not exactly that simple. So we need to talk about coincidence of load, which is basically the coincidence of the peak loads. Basically means when you have a certain number of customers. So, for instance, we have 10 customers. How often do their peak strain they put on the grid? How often is that at the same time? Because that's, even if your customers are all pretty standard households, they won't have their peak consumption at the exact same times. There's some sort of spread around that, and actually that spread is normally distributed. And in the 50s, Alliander used that to derive the following formula, which basically, when you have n customers and you know the yearly power consumption or production of those customers, then you can use this formula to calculate what their peak, what the peak strain they will put on the grid will look like. And in this formula, the K1 and K2, those are actually factors that are determined, that are empirically calculated. So they are based on data sets. And if you want to know more about how those K1 and K2 parameters can be calculated, you can read the paper I referenced at the bottom. So grid operators, they use this formula a lot. They call it the Strand-Axelsen formula because that's another guy in the 70s that popularized it, but it's actually Alliander's formula. But they have all kinds of fact tables filled with those K1 and K2 factors for specific households. And they also do this for technology. So for electric charging, depending on what kind of voltage your car, uses, you can actually estimate for a certain number of electric cars what their peaks, what the maximum strain they will put on the grid is for a certain number of customers. So adding that together, you get a pretty realistic estimate of what kind of strain customers will put on the grid. And interesting to note here as well is that for heating and solar panels, this doesn't apply because, well, when the sun shines, everyone in the street is producing the same amount of power. So in this case, the K1 would be 1 and the K would be, well, it doesn't apply at all. It's just, you take just the peak production of one customer and you multiply that by the amount you have. So, but for cars and cooking, this is very important. So then we have that, and then we have a pretty realistic estimate, a pretty good estimate about the peak consumption and production currently. And we can make some estimates about peak production and consumption in the future. What's also interesting here is to note is that at 100% capacity, that basically means that it goes over certain safety measures that were set up for specific components. But it's actually possible with some trickery in the transformer and to basically stretch this out a little bit. So most of the times when you are at 100% capacity, you will have some issues probably, which can be fixed, can be managed. But the actual moment that you really, really need to change stuff up, it's when you reach 120% capacity. So taking that in mind, we also we actually created a pretty nice graph out of all this data, and we did these calculations for 30,000 low voltage grids, which is basically all grids in the Alliander area, so Amsterdam, Gelderland, over IJssel, Drenthe, part of Utrecht, and we got these grids out of these graphs out of it. Well, as you can see, there's some sort of spread around the two lines, some sort of uncertainty. That is because we calculated multiple scenarios. So we actually calculated 3 scenarios about what kind of adoption rate. So a very pessimistic adoption rate, a very optimistic adoption rate, and that gave somewhere in the middle. So that gave us a nice spread for this. As you can see the line with which models the issues. You can see that rising pretty steadily, and then the blue line, which is actually indicates that 120% capacity is reached. It lags behind a bit, but it follows kind of the same trend. But there's more uncertainty about the final grid expansion moments, as you can see. So yeah, our most optimistic estimate is that over half of the low voltage grids will have some issues in 2050, and so that's and well, the more pessimistic estimate is that it's almost 80%. So there's a lot of work to be done, and this is already even our most optimistic estimate is a lot more pessimistic than the earlier estimates that were made by Alliander, which hovered around, well, we expect about 20% of the grids to experience issues in 2050, which we showed that's not realistic. So what can we do about that? Well, we need to construct more cables and we need to build more transformers, but that takes quite a bit of time, and well, those aren't put there just in a day or something. So we need to actually take measures already before we start laying new cables to try to mitigate these problems that we are expecting in the future. And there are quite a few projects running by making the grid smarter, or making the or doing something with the phases of the power, which I won't bore you with, but if you want to get into technical details afterwards, we can talk about that. But for now, we will talk about actually influencing behavior of customers, which is a project I worked on as well, early 2020. So when you look at your energy bill, you will see that you will pay a sort of tariff to the grid operator. And when you live in Utrecht, there's some money, I think it's 15 euros or something, that goes to Steding, which is the grid operator here. And you pay for your connection to the electricity grid and for the maintenance of that. And this price is mostly fixed for an area. So regardless of what you are doing, if you live in a very small flat and you only use candles at night and you have no dishwasher, then you will pay the same as your neighbor who has a very loud stereo system and 2 electric cars, which does not seem fair, right? So they are actually looking at this, and they think, well, we can make this more fair, but maybe we can also use this to encourage smarter consumption, smarter electricity consumption. So they actually did a pilot among employees of Alliander to, yeah, that's my dishwasher, I'm sorry. So they actually did a pilot among employees to read out their smart meter data without anonymizing it, and actually measuring their peak consumption. They were the peak electricity consumption each month, and using these measurements, they would then determine in what category you would end up for paying your tariffs. So if you were, so for instance, this customer has a large peak ending up in category C near the end of the month. So he will pay for the strain he put at that moment. So at that moment he put quite a bit of a strain on the grid, and he will pay for that. So what's interesting is that when you actually, they also got a dashboard where they could monitor their power usage and in what category they would end up. So they can try to, and the idea was that they could monitor their energy usage and try to end up in lower categories, so try to control it. And we saw that quite a few people were actually very successful in that. So this is a comparison of the January, which was the control month. So and February, which was the first month that the pilot started. And we actually have a lot of data from the half year after that as well, which was not really useful due to COVID because everyone was at home. So I actually wanted to write a small white paper about the energy consumption during COVID, but the privacy officer wouldn't allow me to use the data for that. So that's a shame. Because it was really, you could see some really interesting stuff. But for instance, what you see here is that this is the average consumption for every 50 minutes of a day taken over an entire month. So this average is, so this the average is for, I think it's about 150 people or something. So what you see in January, you see like during and these are also all electric car users, so that's also important to note. So you can see when people rise early in the morning, you can see it goes up a little, then people will go to their work, so it goes down a little, and then around 6 everyone comes home, they plug their electric cars in their charging stations, they start cooking, they do the dishes, they start the washing machine, and you can see a massive spike. And then it slowly goes down again. And what we already saw in the first month is that people were charging their cars way later. And we actually did some pattern recognition on it as well to detect when people were charging their cars. And people would start charging their cars later, or when they had a smart charging station, they would actually allow it to charge at a lower voltage. At a lower wattage, sorry, by the way. And you can see that here very clearly, that the peak here, it's way less high as the peak in January. And you can see that it stays a little bit above the one for the rest of the night, which is mostly cars take longer to charge. So they let their cars charge longer. But these peaks, these are the real problems. So you want to keep these as low as possible. And this was quite successful in influencing that behavior that way. So it was really interesting to see. I think the idea is that this system will replace the current system for a lot of customers in the Alliander area. I'm not sure what the status of that is right now. So yeah, that's one approach you could take, and there are many other ways to deal with problems on the low voltage grid, but I don't think we have time to get into all of those. So in conclusion, well, will it cause a power outage, all those electric cars? Well, not yet. They won't in the foreseeable future, but I hope you have seen today that that's not something that you can actually take for granted. Like, a lot of work and a lot of man hours go into making sure that the lights stay on, especially now with all these changes happening in the energy sector. So I hope you think about that the next time you are enjoying your nice movie or music or something like that. And if there are any questions, I will happily answer those, of course. Thank you.
All right, very cool, Bas. Also a bit of wake-up call. I'll try my best not to use my washing machine, my dryer. Well, I don't have a car yet, so, but I'll try to not turn them on at the same time. We have a few questions. First up, there's another one from Yorick. How would the calculation? Oh, I don't know who asked that, but yeah, please go ahead. Oh, Jasmine, I think. Sorry, I couldn't see who was unmuted. Jasmine, are you there? All right, then I'll read out the question from Yorick. How will this calculation change if homeowners are allowed to supply energy to each other rather than to the energy supplier?
To each other. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, well, let me say that way. Well, actually, when you supply energy back into the grid, like you don't actually control where that goes. It just goes into the grid, and there is it spreads out already across the neighborhood. So that won't change quite a bit. Like you can't actually say I want this specific energy to go to that specific household. You can't do that unless you have specific cables for that. But if you just have a closed grid with some houses connected to it, and you push energy onto that, then it will just, when there's consumption further in the street, then it will just use that energy. It's no problem. It does make it harder to measure what's going on in the grid, though, because when this energy goes into the grid and gets used up at the same time, it makes it it doesn't pass the transformer, and it can put quite a bit of strain on the low voltage cables, because many of them are very old and they aren't built for this, actually. So when a lot of power goes out and comes in, this can cause some instabilities, especially if you live at the end of a street, at the end of a cable, and all your neighbors have solar panels, and that can cause them problems on a sunny day.
All right. A question from Bruno. Instead of influencing the customer, is Alliander also looking at what they can do to lower these peaks? Wouldn't it be possible to put local batteries at the transistor houses to lower the strain of the peak hours?
They aren't looking into that as well. One thing that is interesting to note, but I left it out because it would get too technical, is that actually when you your power connection, there isn't just one phase of electricity going through the cables. Most people are connected to three phases, and what you often see is that when people connect solar panels are connected, they are just randomly connected to one of the phases on the grid. And when everyone in the street is connected to the same phase, then that will massively influence the grid and cause massive instabilities. So sometimes when people call, like, I experience problems with the voltage, then when they are researching this, they will actually read out smart meters, and when they discover that many solar panels on the same phase is the problem, they will actually go to those houses and connect them differently to solve it. So that's also why when we are at 100% capacity, there's a lot of things you can do on that level, and also at the transformer you can basically like optimize it for generation or for supply. You can switch between that. So when there's a lot of generation, you can configure the transformer differently to account for that. So it's a little bit more complex in that way.
As always.
As always, yeah.
Next up, there was a question from Granaatappel.
Yes, that's me. Does this work?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. My question is a bit complex as well. I heard about this project that Eneco is doing. So that's an energy supplier, where they kind of compensate their clients, as in just houses, to be able to like that the houses are flexible in their temperature, and Eneco can control whether there's energy going to that house to heat it up or to let it cool down, so that when there's peak demand, then they can let the house cool down so it doesn't require as much energy. And then once there's a like it kind of charges up their I'd say the warmtepomp heat pumps.
Maybe you're talking about district heating, because that's actually an entirely different thing.
It's not district heating, because I think that uses restwarmte, but you can have a heat pump at each individual house, and that kind of serves as a heat storage for the house.
Yeah, so you actually allow to control your heat pump, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And then they can kind of do the demand response on a house level to mitigate the peak. For them, it would be nice because then they can buy energy when it's really cheap, and then sell it and like buy less when it's pretty expensive. So is that something that Alliander also is collaborating with, or?
Well, there's a lot of all those grid operators, they work together quite and energy suppliers, they work together quite a bit inherently. I think there's also another place I heard where they were experimenting with using the batteries of electric cars to store power during those peaks as well. That's also a possibility, and then compensating customers for the usage of their batteries. But I don't know if Alliander is involved with these kind of initiatives, or if that's solely with the energy suppliers. I'm not sure, actually. I would think so. I would think there would be some communication there at least, but I don't think it's like a collaborative project in that way. So that answer your question?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it does answer my question. I do have a follow-up, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Like it sounds like you're all trying to like fix the same problem. Is there like a vakbond or a group where you come together and discuss how you're all trying to solve it, and if you can coordinate it?
Yeah, there is for grid operators, there's an organization, Netbeheer Nederland, in which they all work together on these kinds of issues as well. So there's a lot of talking between them. But what's important to note is that most grid operators, they actually have their some sort of monopoly on the area they operate in. So on a part of the Netherlands you have Alliander, on another part you have Stedin, on another part you have Enexis. And they are basically, operating individually over there. But they do share, so there are no two grid operators in the same location. But they do share a lot of knowledge and work together on these kinds of problems. That's true. There are lots of organizations spanning those, this field as well. Like you have ADSN, which is also a pretty large organization involved in this kind of stuff, which is also more naturally oriented.
All right, then another question from Jasmine, who asks, do consumers have privacy concerns for releasing their power consumption? What kind of incentives do people that sign up have?
For the pilot, I think.
Or in general, perhaps?
Yeah, in general. Yeah, that's interesting. It's also a little bit, I think it's also a little bit of a precaution from Alliander's side, because but there is actually a lot you can derive from someone's power consumption, for instance, when they are home or not. So it is a little bit sensitive, the data. So it's understandable that they must be careful with that. So many of all of the smart meter data it's mostly locked away, and with very special permissions you can actually access it to, for instance, train models on it, but you must have a very, very good reason to use the raw data from those smart meters. So yeah, but it's a little bit sensitive, which makes the life of a data scientist a little bit harder sometimes. So that's
All right, and a final question, I think, from Bianca. I can imagine there's quite a bit of difference in electricity usage from a demographic point of view. What does Alliander do with this data?
Yeah, exactly. Well, as you saw already, like the tariff system, adjusting that to make it more fair, is already a great step in the right direction. But also the graph you saw about how many of the grids we expect issues in. In the follow-up project, we're also splitting this out on types of neighborhoods. So we can actually, for individual neighborhoods, we can say we expect issues in that year and we expect massive issues in that year. So So we do that in a way already. Like we look at which neighborhoods, which grids are more vulnerable to these developments, and those get prioritized when they are working on the cables. So there are certain grids that are more vulnerable. For instance, I think grids that were built in the 70s, they use some sort of neighborhoods with some sort of pattern, with streets with lots of smaller streets attached to them, so side streets. And those cables, those follow those streets, and those are very vulnerable to these kinds of problems because those cables, they have lots of small branches to them, which are vulnerable to issues when a lot of solar generation is happening over there. So those kind of neighborhoods need to be worked on first in many cases. Does that answer the question?
I hope it does. All right. One final question from Laurens. Would like to ask it himself.
Thanks, Bas, for the great presentation. You showed this formula from like 1952, and you mentioned that it doesn't really apply for solar panels and stuff. Are there any other like technologies or things that are coming to the grid, or things that people are using that you think have a similar like, disruptive mechanism?
Yeah, well, heating is also not for heating. This is also the case because when it's cold, all the houses with electric heating they will be heating. So they will have a coincidence of 100%. Yeah, it took me a lot of effort to find the proper translation for this term. We talk about gelijktijdigheid in Dutch, which maybe makes it a little bit more clear for the Dutch persons here. I'm not sure actually. There are for most technologies that actually consume power, this is pretty normally. You can actually calculate those factors, and you can which is actually a good thing because that means that when not everyone is cooking electrically at the same time. But I can imagine that when you start controlling the behavior of customers with the tariffs, then those factors probably won't apply fully anymore as well, because the distribution of when people are using their electric or cooking is altered in a way. So, but I think they can adjust those for that if they have the proper data. But who knows? But they are actually doing a more expensive research by actually taking estimated power consumption for every hour of a year, for every customer, running that through the grid, through a calculator, which is very complicated, but I can explain it a little bit if someone wants to afterwards. Because I worked for a little bit on that as well, but I moved on to other projects eventually. And they can actually run multiple profiles for certain customers through this calculator. They can actually estimate, all right, we see in the summer that there is, on these days, we expect massive spikes of solar generation that is not properly used, so that's not properly balanced. And they can actually see which specific cables in the ground it will cause problems on. So they actually are working really hard on doing lots of calculations to make way more accurate predictions about the development of the grid. So this was more of a first look in a way. The other project is still ongoing, but I'm no longer involved, I'm afraid. So it's really interesting though.
Cool stuff. Thanks.